Welcome back. Today, we're diving straight into an absolutely mind-bending exploration of reality. I mean, we are literally tearing down the fundamental architecture of how we think about the universe. We're jumping into an explainer of Hankman's post-metaphysical ontology, and I can promise you, by the time we wrap this up, the way you categorize every single thing around you, it's going to be completely turned upside down. So, buckle up for a fast-paced, highly energetic journey straight into the very limits of human reason. Let's get right into it. What exists outside of existence? It sounds like a riddle, right? Or maybe just a flat-out contradiction. I mean, we're so incredibly used to dividing the world neatly into things that are real and things that aren't. But what if that entire framework is actually a trap? Okay, let's dive into this.
Here's our agenda for today. We'll start off with the problem with existence. Then we'll meet the unnameable. After that, we'll tackle the something paradox, navigate our way through the language trap, dodge the potentiality trap, and finally wrap up with liberating our thought.
Section 1. The problem with existence and the flaw in classical ontological logic.
So think about it for a second. Why do we automatically assume that absolutely everything has to either exist or not exist? Hankman points out that this is a massive systemic error in philosophy. See, classical logic is stubbornly bound to the strict binary of existence versus non-existence. If something doesn't exist, traditional logic basically just writes it off as a non-entity. But Hankman, he argues this binary is fundamentally broken. Instead, he proposes a radical shift. The real dividing line isn't about whether something exists, but rather the distinction between nameability and unnameability. By forcing the whole universe into an exists or does not exist box, classical logic is completely blind to what Hankman calls the radically withdrawn.
Moving on to Section 2. Meet the unnameable, the categorial break.
And this brilliantly illustrates the new framework. We are basically throwing out the old dictionary and bringing in a completely new way to categorize reality into two distinct domains. First up, the domain of the nameable. Now notice, this actually includes things that physically exist, like the chair you're sitting in, and things that never exist, like a pure fiction or a unicorn. They're both nameable. Then, on the flip side, we have the category of the unnameable. This is an entirely different beast altogether. It withdraws from every single form of direct address. It lives completely beyond that dialectical tension of being and non-being. You can't directly name it, you can only talk around it, and it represents a there is without ever actually constituting a something.
Think about how incredibly freeing this actually is. When we locate the unnameable completely beyond the realm of existence, that heavy burden of proving its existence just totally disappears. We don't have to forcefully squeeze it into being an object. We're literally liberating our perception of reality from the massive obligation of objecthood. All right, Section 3, the something paradox, breaking the brain.
And I sincerely mean breaking the brain. If your head is starting to spin a little bit right now, don't worry. Hankman literally identifies this exact friction as the greatest possible confusion in metaphysical discourse. But before we hit the paradox itself, let's just make sure we're totally clear on our terms. Quidditas. It basically means somethingness. It's that measurable, definable quality that makes an entity an actual object of thought in formal ontology. Simply put, if you can clearly think about it as an object, it has quidditas.
Now Hankman puts it like this. There is something that is not a something. Just let that sink in for a second, right? How can something be there? How can we possibly acknowledge a there is without it actually having somethingness? It lacks quidditas. It absolutely cannot be an object of your thought, and yet it stubbornly refuses to be nothing.
This contrast right here is the absolute heart of the confusion. The metaphysics of objects demands somethingness and categorial determinability. But Hankman is building an ontology of the non-objectifiable, a phenomenon that completely lacks object quality. So the crucial point is this. If you try to investigate a non-objectifiable phenomenon using the tools and logic designed specifically for objects, you're making a massive categorical error. It's kind of like trying to measure the temperature of a dream with a physical thermometer. The confusion doesn't lie in the unnameable itself. The confusion happens because we're violently forcing the radically other into our comfortable, familiar logic of objects. Which brings us to Section 4, the language trap, circumlocution versus naming.
See, in Hankman's system, our very own language frequently acts as an instrument of ontological deception. Because we can't directly name the unnameable, we're forced to use what's called periphrasis. That's just a fancy term for indirect or circumlocutory speech. Basically, we're forced to talk in circles around it, describing the negative space. But here's the catch. To describe around it, we have no choice but to use words that fundamentally belong to the domain of the nameable.
And that leads to a really profound philosophical trap. The danger here is permanent re-ontologization. The very second we use a word, literally any word, to gesture toward the unnameable, that word falsely gives it this illusory, conceptual clarity. We accidentally turn it back into a something in our minds. By trying to explain it so clearly, we sacrifice its radical alterity, its absolute otherness. Essentially, language tricks us into thinking we've finally grasped it.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 5, the potentiality trap, the pre-structure of questioning.
So, language isn't our only stumbling block here. The very way we frame our questions is rigged from the start. A classic cop-out in philosophy is to say, well, okay, the unnameable doesn't exist right now, but it exists in a space of possibility. It potentially exists. Hankman rejects this completely. He says declaring it as potentially existent is just a biased anticipation of existence. It implies a teleological orientation, meaning it implies that the ultimate goal, or the highest possible state of reality, is to eventually exist.
But Hankman demands we recognize a reality that is not legitimized to a transition into existence. Conceiving of the unnameable is just a mere possibility? That forces it right back under the strict dictate of existential obligation. It completely negates its fundamental inaccessibility. Listen, it doesn't want to exist, it doesn't need to exist, and calling it potential is really just as desperately trying to tame it.
Finally, Section 6, liberating our thought, freedom from the obligation of existence.
So, why does all this heavy, abstract philosophical deconstruction actually matter for you and me? Well, it matters because it completely frees us. Hankman's central results synthesize into three massive shifts. First up, a total reconfiguration of the categorial hierarchy. Nameability replaces existence as the ultimate dividing line. Second, a sharp critique of linguistic representation. We now know that describing around the unnameable is a dangerous heuristic that tempts us to turn it back into a something. And third, the destruction of the space of possibility. We absolutely must reject potentialities so we don't end up treating the unnameable as just some deficient preliminary stage of existence.
Ultimately, leaving the unnameable in its alterity, its pure, untouchable otherness, is the highest expression of ontological integrity. Acknowledging that the architecture of our human reason has hard limits isn't some failure of our intellect. Actually, scratch that. It's the exact opposite. It's the ultimate liberation of our thought. We don't have to forcefully expand our logic to conquer everything. We can simply and respectfully acknowledge the radically withdrawn.
So I want to leave you with this final, lingering question to chew on. How can you genuinely think about something that you can't even name? As you go about your day-to-day, look around at all the objects you so easily categorize. And then just pause. Ask yourself where the limits of your own reason and your own language truly lie. What is silently withdrawing from your reality, just beyond the reach of your words? Keep thinking, keep questioning, and I will catch you in the next explainer.